Next up on the Distributed FutureSync conference stream is Eriol Fox. Eriol is a humanitarian designer and has recently set up an organisation called humanitarian.design to help facilitate just that. In this session, they are going to be looking at ethnographic design and how user research plays into that. Now, I'm not quite sure what ethnographic design is, but I'm intrigued to find out what, and I hope you are too. Hope you enjoy this talk.
Hello and welcome to this talk about doing UX research and ethnographic design for humanitarian technology. The projects that I reference in this talk are in the areas of peace building and crisis response specifically in relation to humanitarian work. And there will be specific stories and some general tips and advice for undertaking UX research or field work in a country or community that isn't one of your own origin, or it's outside your comfort zone, or you've not visited before in a research context. There's some really difficult topics covered in this talk, such as violence against women, the Manchester arena bombing, radicalisation of youth and terrorism, natural disasters and crises, colonialisation, racism, and prejudice against people with a different educational background or social status. There's also some slides which say no photos or copies, please. Please don't take these slides and redistribute in any way, please. So my name is Eriol. I'm a humanitarian designer or a human rights-centered designer. My pronouns are they, them. And I've been working in design for 10 years now with a product and a UX focus over the last 5 or so years. And I've been in the community development and humanitarian space for around 7-ish years. The content of this talk was from when I worked at an organisation called Ushahidi. Ushahidi is a Kenyan-based NGO and they make open source humanitarian technology for human rights cases and human rights needs. Ushahidi was founded in 2007-2008 during election turmoil in Kenya. Ushahidi's tech tools are most commonly used for citizen-led advocacy work, anti-corruption and accountability, disaster and crisis response, citizen empowerment and election monitoring, basically any human rights-focused work. First of all, you may have heard different terms like developing countries and the global south when looking into humanitarian work or engaging with different humanitarian work. The names and labels for other places are vast and often confusing. And there's really no perfect language here. And this is one of the first things that you'll be learning when you engage with humanitarian work, the jargon that is used around different places. I'll be using different terms every now and then, but when I focus on a specific country, I will label that country and refer to it as such. One piece of advice that I would give you is to tend to avoid generalizing as developing countries and really try and name the country that you're specifically interested in. So the first project that I'm referencing in this talk is one called Izuku, which means Fountain of Peace in Kinyarwanda, which is one of Rwanda's national languages. And Izuku was a EU-funded consortium project undertaken by universities, non-profits and companies. Consortium means a collection of different people within different sort of organisation structures. And its aim was to explore the potential of digital technologies to support peace through testing and development in Rwanda and Kenya, and over this period of 3 years. You can find out more at izuku.eu. And the second project that I'll be referencing is called Dispatcher, which was a shorter project over 6 months with a minimum viable product focus, so a product at the end of the research focus rather than pure research as Izuku was. Dispatcher's aim was to discover whether technology could help people create and maintain resilience in times of crisis, and what kind of technology aids rather than overwhelms during those times of crisis. We were really looking at a community cohesion and how people globally help each other in response to a crisis, linked to resilience in both an individual way but also a group way. So, why Rwanda and Kenya for these two separate projects? Though it may feel like a given to be doing humanitarian work in these kinds of places, it's important to understand and explore why you're doing work in a specific location. Rwanda's history with genocide led to a number of social policies and projects that came from that horrific event. And Kenya's history of tribal and political conflict allowed for exploration into multiple different kinds of crises. But when you're looking at where to conduct your research, ask yourself these questions. Why is this the country or city that I want to investigate this problem in? And what can I learn from the community here that I might find more difficult in my country of residence or country of origin or where you're comfortable? And what unique problems am I committing to solve by researching here? Even if you're likely to conduct research in the country or community of origin, this is a good practice to get into, asking these questions. Why here? Even though Rwanda and Kenya were legitimately relevant places to conduct this study in, there's something to be said around grant funding and how it stipulates, often in the proposal phase, where the research should happen and where the work should be happening, the humanitarian work. And this often really restricts the opportunity for design research to discover other locations that could be relevant too. Only if you could find a partner organisation in that other location and create a new branch of the research to look for funding could this really be done alongside the official grant. Personally, I would often find myself doing research on multiple different projects continuously as I visited places that had relevance. So even though the official research was being done in Rwanda around peace building, I did satellite research for Izuku when I visited Kazakhstan, Tunisia, and Romania for other projects. And a tricky thing that comes up with the academia side of grant funding when there's an academic partner involved is when the methodologies that these academic partners choose to conduct or believe that they need to be using within this project can be restrictive. So when the methodology that you're using and testing becomes a restriction on how you engage with or conduct your research. And as practitioners, rather than academics, we often use methods that will gain us the pathways and results that we're most interested in exploring, and it allows us to pivot in ways that sometimes academia doesn't allow. And academia and academics often have different needs and different outcomes from the research than practitioners have. They need to be able to often record deep detail in really great deep detail and code the results for papers. And they tend to be focused on the insight and the artifacts of the research rather than the engagement and the learnings and how those are implemented into products that are used. I had many a heated debate with academic partners about flexibility with methodologies within these projects that we were doing. Out of curiosity, the methodology that we used within Izuku was called Living Labs. And this diagram on the screen right now demonstrates where Living Labs sits within different kinds of design methodology. It sits really closely with participatory design, but it's very much closer to an open source way of doing things. So it's led by users. In Dispatcher, we didn't have an academic partner involved, and therefore we were able to really structure and play with how we approached that research a lot more fluidly. Often involved in humanitarian work are civil society organisations, and they are sometimes called different things. They're sometimes called government institutions. Basically, these are organisations that play a part in policy or government in some way. They were an integral stakeholder of peace within the Izuku project, and they were a key group to include within our research. However, from previous experience, a team member flagged that CSOs, civil society organisations, would have different needs and expectations of research work and workshop work than the general public we were engaging with. This would be in relation to the content that we were building and discovering, as well as the format in which we engaged them with. And in order to attend and also benefit, we needed to offer them more value beyond simply participation in the workshops. So with the public, we did these activities. We did user journeys, personas, stakeholder mapping, and rapid prototyping. But we chose not to do user scenarios, which was part of the academic methodology. We chose to omit that part after discussing what was relevant to our public members. And for CSOs, we really focused in on sharing what we had learned from the public from previous workshops the day before, and offered the value of the initial public research and worked with them to understand how this had been achieved by us, and then further enveloping their CSO experience with that of the public. And the things we did with the CSOs were defining what peace meant to them and their organizations, understanding the user journeys and personas from the public, doing tech demos, and doing something called impact mapping. We spent the entire morning of the workshop with the CSOs focusing in on these public user journeys and helping them understand these things. It really enabled them to build empathy with the public, the people that they were serving, and really critically analyze their current peace-building activities, and the ability for them to then rapidly prototype with technology that we were demonstrating. They took to that much more easily once they had gone through that understanding phase. And this leads to a learning that I have from this, which is flexibility within the boundaries. We really need to understand the value of flexibility. One of the things that we also did flexibly was we adapted the persona activity for the public workshops after witnessing the public members being very uncomfortable with long form writing, especially when it was their second or third language that they wrote or spoke. We changed the persona activity, which was written at first, to an interview process for the second public workshop that we did. And this not only built rapport within the members of the workshop, but it also allowed for discussion on deeper persona topics. So by being flexible, we actually allowed for more discovery work. This comes to another learning that we had when engaging with members of the public, which was something that we kind of call aid language. So these are people that are very proficient with non-profit lingo or jargon. So they often use this kind of language or phrases with researchers, especially when they're very visibly from the West or from developed countries. This is often to appear fundable or to feel more credible part of the conversation. To give you some advice on this part is to be aware and sympathetic of when this happens, and to not let it affect, as much as you can, not let it affect your relationship, and just work that little bit harder about breaking down those barriers between cultures. Moving on to one of the really important topics of this talk, which is working with trauma. It's really important to understand that when you're working with a humanitarian purpose, a humanitarian concept, to preemptively work with the ideas that may come around with trauma will help you when you are potentially confronted by these subjects in reality. So I anticipated this when I was planning the research for both Izuku and Dispatcher. So one of the public groups that we worked with was this group here on the screen. This is a group of women called Polycom Women. They are women across generations and backgrounds dedicated to peace building in a central area of Nairobi, which is called Kibera, which is a informal settlement or slum. They have lots of different issues in Kibera, political, social, and economical. So working with Polycom and the other attendees of the workshop as well was one of the first times that I'd really been confronted with my own personal experiences of trauma and relationship with trauma, as well as other people's, and how to manage that in a research context. So the first time I'd managed it in a research context. And one of the things, if you remember, they were asked to do was a journey map. And the journey map was of a crisis that they had experienced. Some of the attendees were talking about when they were kidnapped, some robbed, some with gender-based violence, tribal violence, and political violence. And one of the Polycon women spoke in detail about how a peaceful protest activity ended in an injury when they were stoned by the members of the public around them for being outspoken. And here you can see some detail from a journey map from one participant, separated into the before, during, and after phase of a crisis. It's got the typical details that you might find in a journey map, the things that they were hearing, seeing, feeling, as well as technology that they were using, because this is what we were investigating. But when you look in more detail at the things on these journey maps, they really hit hard, so you can see participants listing things like war and tribal conflict and high food prices in response to violence and the sound of bullets. And I'm not sure about any of you listening, but I really truly struggle to understand these circumstances and how to respond to it as a researcher as well as a fellow human. But one of the ways we were able to work with this really well was the attention that we paid to this trauma in our planning. So here was my own journey map that I created as an example to the workshop of my experience, though it's secondhand, with the Manchester Arena bombing at the Ariana Grande concert that happened in the UK. What this allowed us to do was really connect with our participants in a really authentic way. So a piece of homework that you might want to try, if you've never tried this before, is think of a deeply upsetting event in your life. It doesn't need to be a crisis. It doesn't need to be at the scale of what we've been talking about now, but something that was deeply upsetting to you, and try and journey map that. And I really recommend to try this to really start to understand your own responses to difficult subject matter and the commodification of that into design artifacts. There were other ways in which we ensured what we were doing within this workshop, these workshop scenarios, was ethical. These are some of the other things that we put in place as well. So good things to make sure that you're putting into practice. The researchers went through the same processes. They did examples and built this compassionate connection with the participants through those examples. The attendees were notified prior to the workshop of the subject matter that would be discussed and worked with. There was psychological support on site for both researchers and participants. Absolute confidentiality on what was talked about, and release forms in order to be able to use the content. And the researchers as well were supported post the workshop. Moving on from this, there's another thing that comes up that isn't fully trauma related, but is still something worth practicing as a researcher, especially when you're in these countries where you're outside of your comfort zone or within this humanitarian context. And this is your physical and emotional reactions to participants and what they tell you or how they react to subject matter. So this is an example of when I was with a person and we were talking about what poverty is and the difference between UK Western poverty and Kenyan poverty. And this was about an app. Remember, we were talking about a product, a digital product, but you can get onto these really tough topics quite easily when you talk about the humanitarian uses of technology. So be ready for conversations like this, where poverty and class system and how they're different in different places. And to better understand those things and to listen to those conversations, to those points, and try to battle any bias or any ill-informed reactions that you might have based on your own experience and opinions. Surprising subjects will arise, and the more that you can do in your practice, in your safe places, in your organizations, with your colleagues, the better you will be when you have these experiences with participants within workshops. So other topics that came up around these kinds of subjects was I'm very visibly white. I'm very visibly and audibly UK based. I have an English accent. And there is an inherent historical context around colonialization when you're doing work in countries that were former colonies of whichever country you are from. And personally, I think the best way to approach this is with complete honesty and transparency. The more that you don't want to address that topic in conversation, the less respect you're showing to a participant that brings that to the conversation. So, however, be tactful and respectful. This should not be the primary topic of the conversation unless they bring it to the conversation. But be ready with that atmospheric understanding of these issues. And sometimes reading the history and the culture of where you're going is super important to really be ready for these kinds of conversations. Because it relates to something that is so important with the research that we do, which is building a relationship, building trust within the dynamic of researcher and participant. And this is especially important when you don't share a lot of obvious commonality. You're not from the same country. You're coming in to do something based on learning from them. And one of the ways that you can prepare for this is to think about the things in which you can relate to somebody about. So can you relate on a race or ethnic background? Can you relate on a perceived gender identity or sexual identity? Can you relate on a similar social status or similar background or similar experiences, circumstances or interests in education? And if none of these things are available to build your relationship with your participants, one thing that I found is often a good universal is food and enjoying local food or having an interest in what the local food is. It's a real common relationship builder, is how we survive and how we eat as people. Although I would also like to mention that you should be really careful with people with food related trauma, especially if you're looking at a humanitarian crisis aid related issue. So even things that we think are universal values that we can connect over, sometimes there is trauma that is underneath those things too. So there's a topic that I'm still having a lot of thought about, and this is the topic of deep ethnographic work versus a kind of dip in, dip out researcher approach. And I wanted to spend some time exploring what my understanding of these kind of two ways of doing research are, and how they don't necessarily clash as much as what we might think that they do. And personally, I lean more towards a deep ethnographic approach. It's largely from my experience within community development and humanitarian causes outside of a design research point of view. But I kind of want to explore these two topics. So this is what deep ethnographic looks like to me. It looks like that my colleague here sat around a table with community members in Kathmandu, in Nepal, working on a project, a mapping project that helped to build resilience after the Nepal earthquakes. And this colleague really helped me to understand what an ethnographic and anthropological approach to design research could be, because he spent months in that community in Nepal working on that project and really understanding what was of value within that community. And for me personally, ethnographic and deep research, deep ethnographic looks like this for me. So this is me doing my on the ground work for crisis response with Team Rubicon UK. This is flood prevention work in Dartmoor in the UK, and the other picture is from a homelessness crisis response project with SARAID, Community Resilience Team. And in a general sense, what deep ethnographic work in a design context means to me is that you make a genuine connection to that group or subject, and you really do become part of that group. And you can get incredibly rich information from this approach. It's kind of a long game sometimes. Sometimes it's not as long. Sometimes people will impart really deep information to you in short periods of time. But it does require a genuine connection as opposed to the kind of dip in, dip out approach, which we'll explore next. The other thing to be aware of with deep ethnographic work is it can lead to bias really quickly. So being self-aware of what you're experiencing and your relationship to that and the community, and also that genuine connection, is really key. It does get complicated quite quick, I think, depending on the kind of person that you are, but as long as you understand the difference between how you're gathering information and relating it to the work that you do as well, and how that sits with your genuine connection, I think that it can work really well. And the dip in, dip out approach is often, I think, what is the more traditional approach for design research and what is seen in the non-humanitarian design world. And this is perhaps due to the life cycle of projects and client work. And what it does is it typically trusts that you can gather that needed information quickly. And that the information that you gather quickly is that most important information. So I think that there is still a place for dip in, dip out, and we used it a lot within Dispatcher and within Isuku as well as blending some of the deeper ethnographic work as well that I was doing. But I think sometimes with complex topics like crisis and peace, I really did still lean towards a deeper ethnographic understanding and creating bonds with the people that I was working with and doing what they were doing alongside them, so that they knew to some extent that I'm interested, I'm here, and this is something that I do care about as a person as well as a researcher. Alongside that topic is something that's really important, which is staying safe and staying healthy. There's so much that I could cover within how to do humanitarian design research abroad in different countries other than Western countries. But one of the key things that I could not miss out was how to stay safe. So take extra devices, extra phones, make sure that you have a way to connect to people, make sure you've done your prep work on what a country deems legal and illegal. Make sure that when you're doing interviews and meeting members of the public, you do that in pairs or threes. Make sure you're using trusted transportation. Make sure you're sharing where you're going with your research partners, your colleagues. And absolutely, I would never recommend that you take on solo research projects. Make sure that you're choosing safe areas when you're doing your interviews, and also take care of the safety of your participants as well. Make sure that if you can vet those areas beforehand as your group, but also trust that a participant is wanting to stay safe as well. So there's other things to be aware of in staying safe and staying healthy. So one thing that's unique to, I think, some various African countries, but within Kenya, there was a concept around acceptable lateness. So we always expected participants to be within that locally accepted lateness standard. So they were usually anything between like 5 minutes to 20 minutes late. And this is due to some pretty standard things like traffic. The last thing on safety and staying healthy is make sure that you keep a very comprehensive healthcare kit, a first aid kit, and look into the local police and hospital structures. What you can also do is simulate and discuss what you would do in these circumstances and make sure that you have a safety policy and a travel policy within your organizations. So wrapping up this subject, even though there's so much that I could talk about, so many more stories, so many more anecdotes from the field research that I've done, 35 minutes is never enough to cover everything. Here's some very quick things that you can do alongside the things that I've already talked about, doing your own field study in an emerging market. It might not always be in a humanitarian context, so you might be doing research within an emerging market for a commercial product. This is still useful. So what you can practice on your next holiday. If you go abroad or to a far destination, even if you don't go far, you could act like you are. You can do community research online. So whenever I go somewhere, I do a really in-depth look at what meetups are happening in this city or in this country, what Facebook groups are there. Can you look on couchsurfing and Interpals or Penpal websites to really try and connect up with people, ask them questions and explore cultures and communities remotely online before you visit. Photography is super important, not only for the actual research capture side of things, but also for understanding what a city is like. So take as many photos as you possibly can with consent. Posters in cafes, graffiti, notice boards, signage, the way that roads are paved, everything is data when you're exploring research within a context that you're not familiar with. And one thing that might feel a bit weird to begin with is talking to taxi drivers about your topic. So most taxi drivers are that you can share a common language with will happily offer you their insights on topics that are relevant to them. Even if it's not relevant to them, they're happy usually to have a conversation about a large-scale important topic, especially if it's something that they've also experienced in a country. But also be careful within taxis. You are in a stranger's vehicle, so there is a power imbalance here. And I remember I've had many a conversation in relation to research where I've started to feel uncomfortable about somebody's point of view or experience because it's not something that I share. So make sure that you also feel safe at the point. And again, if you can do it in pairs, that's ideal. Pairs or threes, or definitely more than just you as an individual. One of the best things that you can do without much effort at all is reading reports from humanitarian organisations and NGOs. They publish a lot of reports, a lot of papers. Some are tech related and some are not. It depends on what you are searching for. Here are two great ones that I think are fantastic flavour for understanding how reports are. There's this one, Leaving No One Behind, Lessons from the Kerala Disasters. Kerala is an area of southwest India that experienced some really heavy flooding in 2018 and 2019. And the next one is always published by the GSMA, I believe, which is the mobile economy in sub-Saharan Africa. It's a fascinating report about how people use mobile devices across sub-Saharan Africa. The next thing that you can do is attend conferences and events that are focused around humanitarian issues or human rights. And here is a great list of some of them. RightsCon is an international one. The Internet Freedom Festival, again, an international one. MozFest as well is international. There's Peace Tech Labs that do events specifically around peace. And there's always your local Tech for Good events that are happening across the globe, really. You can attend these wherever you're visiting. And general meetups are usually always quite good for these kinds of things. Following other organisations and the work that they do is fantastic advice that I can give. Have a look at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, Access Now, the Advocacy Assembly, and the Centre for Humanitarian Data. So some of these are advocacy organisations, some of them are platforms for teaching human rights activists. Advocacy Assembly is a learning platform for human rights activists. And the Humanitarian Data Centre is huge amounts of data from humanitarian organisations that they've captured during their work in different countries. It's a fascinating resource of just huge amounts of data that's sometimes a little bit hard to read, but it's still worth going through. And all of my talks include a slide of books, usually. I love reading. I think that you can learn some of the best things in your life from books, and here are some great ones about humanitarian causes, democracy, digital economies from marginalized countries or countries that are, still developing their economy, and different kinds of structures of community organizing. So these books are super useful and really worth reading. And this brings me to the end of my talk. There's so many other projects that I haven't been able to talk about. I've just talked very briefly about 2 different projects within my experience. There's projects around HIV and AIDS across different African countries. There's work that I've done around crisis in East Asia. There's lots of emerging work being done in South America around democracy, and still so much work being done in Eastern Europe around democracy and the changing play of how we interact with different kinds of news media online. So stay interested in humanitarian topics. You can find me online in all of these different places, and consider reaching out to me if you're interested in hearing more about humanitarian work and design. Thank you very much, and I hope you really enjoy the rest of the Future Sync talks. I can't wait to be there in person next time they hold their conference. Thank you.